Hey everyone, a lot of people often ask what the difference is between like a diamond and master player, a master and GM player, or a GM and a challenger player. And realistically, the difference is very small. Everyone knows all the good comps to go for, especially if you tune in every Friday to bunnymuffins.lol. Everyone has the best stats. But the difference between a good and great player is going to be those small micro adjustments in their positioning. And this has been even more true in recent sets, especially set 10. In this video, we will be providing 7 tips to make your good positioning into great positioning, going through a lot of common concepts in much more detail than anywhere else you can find. So let's just get right into it. Let's start off with how to position your frontline carries. So in past sets, front lines have been pretty troublesome to balance because they would either have an aggro drop mechanic that protects them from big burst damage, assassin type jumps, or overstated defensive stats such as armor and magic resist. This set, the front lines do not have aggro drops, but there are some interesting ways to position them to maximize their use. So a common thing that a lot of players do is they put their carries kind of in the second row so that someone else tanks first and then the unit goes in after that, such as this Yone over here if you're carrying him. However, some people started building Edge of Night. Edge of Night gives you an aggro drop at 60% health once per combat, and then once they have that, they just put their carries back up front. This is a common mistake I see. There are situations where it is okay to do it. For example, if you're facing someone and they're in the top left and you want to go opposite side, of course you could front row them over here, for example, because then they will not get targeted first by their primary carry. However, in most cases, especially a lot of people doing like what's called AFK positioning, as in like no scouting, even with the Edge of Night, you should still second row your carry. Another mistake I see people doing is being extra safe with their carry and they put them in the third row or they accidentally block them. This causes your primary carry to have to walk around units and it wastes a lot of time and you lose a lot of DPS. So pretty much like, I don't know why people are doing that. I don't know where they found that from, for example, but you pretty much always want to second row your carry unless there are very specific circumstances to a fight. Other times you can front row your carry is when you have stuff like Titan's Resolves. That way they take aggro up front. Or if you have like really powerful items such as Radiance or Death's Defiance, for example, because that just makes them like super durable that sometimes no matter what damage they take in the front does not really matter. Speaking of a champion like Yone though, he is a crowd diver, so after crowd divers die, they leap into the furthest enemy dealing magic damage and they also stun enemies within 1 hex. However, one thing that you need to note is that they deal bonus damage increased by 1% for each second that passes. So a lot of times, even if you do have these like godlike items, sometimes you still want to second row your carry and have someone else tank up front. Another thing to keep in mind when you are playing a bunch of crowd divers is to kind of spread them out. You want one on the left side, one on the right side. That way, no matter which corner they put their carries in, your unit can jump to the other side. Another neat little trick to kind of wrap into the enemy carry or to like jump at the enemy carry, because Yone is also an edgelord. Edgelords, whenever their target drops below 50% health, they dash through them. What you can do is actually put Zed next to your Yone, and Zed's shadow works very oddly. He creates a shadow and the shadow actually takes up a space. So sometimes Yone can dash past people all the way into the back line. So I like keeping my Yone and my Zed together when I'm playing some sort of crowd diver comp. Doesn't happen all the time, but it happens often enough that the payoff is very well worth it because you get a free win every now and then. Now, what should you do if you are playing against crowd divers? Let's say you are playing like a rapid fire comp. You have Caitlyn, you have Lucian, you have Senna, and you kind of group them up in the corner over here. That's something that you should not do because what happens if Zed dies, he's going to go and jump into your people over there. So what you want to do is like kind of spread them out. Move one person in one corner, one person in the other corner, and then another ranged unit kind of in the middle. That way, when they do end up jumping over, they don't hit any of your main people. If you know that you are 100% facing a crowd diver, you could even try putting them in the center in the back. Let's say Caitlyn is your main carry. Let's just throw some items on her for fun. In this position, she won't get hit by anything. And assuming there's no other CC in the middle of the map, this is going to be something that's perfectly fine to do. But you do have to watch out because sometimes Yone can jump to the back and then oftentimes he might move towards the middle. Other units to look out for when you do this middle positioning is Thresh, because when their Thresh is even like over here, sometimes he will still hook your carry even if they're in the back over there. The good news is that a lot of times people who play crowd divers don't really play Thresh, so you don't have to worry about it. You just have to worry about your other matchups in that sense. So look at your matchups. You can tell on the right-hand side, when you're in game, there will be like a little sword next to them. Those are the people you could possibly face in the next round. The last thing we want to cover when playing crowd divers is always put your Kiana in front of their enemy units with items. So if they have like a unit over here, like their main tank Thresh over here, they have like a Blitzcrank over here, and they both have items, try to put your Kiana in front of them. That way she always steals their items and it just makes your team really powerful really quickly. Kiana's a very easy way to get free wins just because of superior positioning and swapping at the last second. Next up, we have Illaoi. Illaoi has 2 manually placeable tentacles that you can kind of put anywhere on your board. And when you upgrade your Illaoi, these tentacles do get a little bit stronger. The important part about Illaoi is her active. She revives or fully heals the lowest health tentacle, and also leaps at the nearest enemy and deals magic damage in a large circle, and the tentacles slam in unison. That means one way to use Illaoi is to use one of the tentacles as like a tank tentacle in the front row, and then have one as a damage dealer in the second row. Obviously, there are situations where you want to put both of them in the second row or both of them in the front row, but generally, if I had to do a default positioning, I'd put one in the second row, one in the front. Another great thing that Illaoi can do with her tentacles is that she's a really good counter to Akali. So what KDA Akali does is that she jumps to the furthest enemy unit on the board. So if she's on the enemy team, she's starting over here. She's going to jump all the way to this tentacle pretty much no matter what. So there's a way to set up your tentacles so that she kind of dashes in between them all the time. And it's something like this or like this, where she jumps here, jumps there, jumps back and forth. And then oftentimes Akali can even respawn her tentacles, so she keeps jumping back and forth while your carry is somewhere, let's say, over here, dodging all the Akali hits. So Akali jumps there, or even to like one of your melees over there, and she pretty much never hits your Caitlyn. If you want to be super safe, because if the Akali switches to this side over here, she might dash over there. So what you can do is move your Caitlyn to the middle and move this tentacle to the side there. The only issue with this is that sometimes she takes some collateral damage as Akali is dashing through everyone, but oftentimes it's not enough to kill your Caitlyn. Other units this is useful against is going to be Ezreal, other Caitlyn's, because Caitlyn shoots a lot of people in the backline, and also Karthus. But no one really plays Karthus right now, but maybe that changes in future patches. Next, let's think about hard crowd control units. So we have Kennen, we have Aphelios, Amumu, Echo, Lulu, Vex for the 3 costs. 4 costs, we have Zac, Thresh, and Ahri. And then for the 5 costs, we have Kiana. I also forgot, Nami also CCs as well. So it might be easy to just think like, oh, since Echo, Thresh, and Amumu all have AoE CC, put them next to the most units. Oftentimes that will work, but there are other things you kind of want to consider. So really high priority units on the enemy team to CC would be something like Illaoi. Illaoi, when she's on the other side, she's going to be respawning her tentacles really often. So what you can do is try to stun her to try to delay that effect, putting them in front of their melee carries such as Yone, Viego, or Zed that we looked at before. Especially if they don't have Edge and Night, they often just like get stunned and died out before they could lifesteal back to full. That's why Ahri is really useful. If you ever get Ahri and you're facing a melee matchup such as like Jax, for example, put her on the same side, and oftentimes she'll kill that unit before they get to do that much. So if Jax is on the right side, depending on your KDA setup, of course, try to put your Ahri on the right side as well. If Jax is on the left, put her on the left. A lot of people are afraid to do this because a lot of the units right now that are melee carries, they kind of like hop over things. But that actually helps your Ahri because once they kill their first target, they switch onto the main carry, and then they just kill them in 2 hits. The first one being a stun, second one being like a big chunk of damage. Other things you could do is think of things like chain CC. If you ever do have like mana items on some of your carries, maybe you have like a Winter's Vow on Echo, maybe you have like a Redemption on Thresh, this changes the mana of the unit. So Thresh has 160 mana and starts at 70. And each time you auto attack, you get 10 mana, and when you take damage, you gain mana as well. But these items, the Protector's Vow and the Redemption, they give like 15 mana. This one gives 30. You can kind of time their crowd control effects so that they overlap in a lot of cases. So you just have to watch the fights, see which units are taking damage at certain times, see when they proc their effect, and then kind of combine the 2 units together. You want to do this against teams that only care about one unit. So let's say someone's playing like Riven Reroll. None of the other units in Riven Reroll matter that much, so you really just want to stack all the CC on them. However, if someone's playing like a duo carry comp or even like a trio carry comp, then you don't need to stack the CCs. You can kind of separate your Thresh and your Echo so that they stun different units on each side. One other thing to keep in mind is you generally want to put these CC units on the edge so that they take more damage and sometimes cast more often. Sometimes they die before they get their second cast off, especially with Thresh. Sometimes he's just like a one-hit wonder. But if you have a bunch of tank items on him, or if you have Headliner Thresh, Headliner Thresh is really, really, really good at getting multiple casts off. Next, let's go over wrapping. So people get wrapped all the time, and especially at lower ratings. But even in like Diamond, my friend, I watch him play all the time. He always gets wrapped because he just positions by default and doesn't change it the whole game. And wrapping is really bad. It's essentially what happens when, let's say, someone has like a Zed and they're facing your team, and the Zed walks all the way to your Vex, kills the Vex, then walks to your Samira, kills your Samira. Not a good thing, right? Because it just bypasses all your tanks. So I'm going to try to teach you how to like induce wrapping and also prevent getting wrapped on. So pretty much wrapping shouldn't happen that often. But the mistake that people make in the country comp is that they put everyone on the left, and it opens you up for that because you have no tanks to catch anyone on the right. That's why a lot of people, they love separating their teams, something like this, so that one, you avoid a bunch of AoEs, and also it prevents a lot of those wrapping issues in a lot of cases. So one easy way to prevent that in the country comp is to move your Vex closer to your Samira so that the enemy melee carries don't just get to like freely walk into your team like this. They have to go through set first, and then since Vex isn't nearby, they'll have to jump to Tahm Kench, Thresh, and Amumu. You could even do that with the positioning like this and have no one on the right side at all. But it's always generally good to have someone on the right, but it's equally important to keep your Vex somewhat near your Samira. You could put it next to her, but sometimes you get AoE'd. If someone has like a crowd diver, the Evelynn can just like jump over there, stun your Samira and Vex at the same time. So I like keeping one space of separation whenever I try to position my back line. But again, another easy way to avoid this is just move some tanks to the right side, some on the left side. And that way, like pretty much you won't get wrapped at all. So first they'll target Thresh, he dies. Then they target Tahm Kench, he dies. Then it's most likely your Set or Katarina, they die. And then your Amumu, then your Urgot, and then finally your backline. That's typically what's going to happen. Again, country is probably the most susceptible comp to it. Another comp that this happens to pretty often is the punk build. So the punk build suffers from an issue of not having a lot of tanks. A lot of times people just often put 3 of them right in the middle. And again, sometimes you could get wrapped on in a lot of specific cases, especially if you do something like this. Even if you put your primary carry on the right side, put the Twitch in the position that we talked about before, 1 square away from your carry. But then people often like putting bait units on the other side for things like Akali's that dash over. But here again, you still could get wrapped. It doesn't happen all the time, but Vex could get hit, and then the enemy carry could walk to your backline for free, skipping all your tanks. This is especially true if Vi is your weakest tank, which in this case she is, because then they kill her really easily. Sometimes if people have 2 melee units, maybe they have a Yasuo attacking and a Yone attacking, the Yone came all the way around here, and instead of wrapping to the Vex, which sometimes it does, it instead wrapped around to the Vi. Vi died, and then they go towards the Vex after that if your Pantheon moved for some reason. It happens all the time. You could even stack like multiple units on the right-hand side, such as having Yone along with like, let's say a Zed, and then Yone would walk like this, and then Zed would walk like that, and then thus attacking your Vex, and you get destroyed that way. So the easy way to prevent this in a comp without a lot of tanks is, again, just spread out the tanks. You could do something like this. Don't put your weakest tank on the edge like that in these situations. You could kind of just do something like this. 1 strong tank on the left side, 1 strong tank on the right side, and you'll pretty much be good to go from there. All right, how do we induce wrapping now? Let's look at like the crowd diver build, because that's probably like one of the most popular ones. In this build, you often have a ton of melee units, so you could do that whole like walking timing that we saw in the last example, where you have 3 melee units on one side, and then they each like cover a different space, forcing one person to go to the back. So what some people like to do is putting their primary carry all the way on the edge. You could put them in the front line, sometimes a second line like we talked about before. And in that way, like Viego walks up to one of their tanks, and then your Yone, if they miss position, can punish them and go straight to their backline in some cases. Kiana, you want to keep up front. You want to keep your Even Shroud next to your Yone. And then Zed, you could put them next to your people as well. So there is a weird interaction where sometimes Zed Shadow blocks a space for the edgelords to jump to. So sometimes they jump to like a wild space. So keeping your Zed next to your Yone or Zed next to your Jax if you're running a Jax build is a pretty interesting idea if you want to like try to abuse that every now and then. It doesn't always work because fight RNG is like fight RNG. It's random, so we can't always time it, but it's something to keep in mind. But again, just keep your carries on the side, stack a lot of your melees in one direction, and then if the opponent makes a mistake, you get a free round win. It doesn't happen all the time, but the times where it does, obviously you're super happy. Like you can't like play around the opponents making a mistake, but if they do, you should be ready to punish it. While we're on this, let's talk about some positioning tricks that you could do with edgelords. So if you want to read the edgelord trait, they gain attack speed, which doubles when their target drops below a certain amount of health, and then edgelords within one hex range dash through them on the next attack. So the first thing we need to pay attention to is the 50% health threshold, because Without the dash, just gaining double attack speed is very, very important because that's just extra damage. So what you want to do, you may notice how I have this defaulted like that already. I have most of my main damage dealers all on the same side. I don't have like Zed on one side, Yone on the other, and then Viego in the middle, for example. I have like my 2 highest damage dealing units, Zed and Yone, and then the third one in Viego, all on the same side so that they have the potential to focus the same target. Qiyana's a little weird. Obviously, she does do a lot of damage, but you want her in the center because most people put their tanks default in like the front and center, and she copies items from their main tanks, which is what her entire role is. So you don't need her to be near your Yone in a lot of cases, unless you know 100% that they have an item holder there. But typically you want all 3 of your damage dealers next to each other whenever you're running edgelords because they'll just give the attack speed bonus to your edgelords as soon as possible. So obviously you want your units in the corner. Let's say my Yone was over here attacking the Mordekaiser. He'll dash this way over there, but sometimes you could trick it out so you position him over here and then he dashes towards where Katarina is. You have to really look at where the opponent's tanks are to really figure this out. If Mordekaiser is all the way on the edge, sometimes if you put your Yone there, he'll dash over here, and then potentially after killing the Mordekaiser, he'll go into the enemy carry. So there are going to be some cases, even though we'd have the default positioning as Yone over here, so there are some cases where we'd want him next to the Zed so that he would dash into that little corner there to hopefully get to the enemy carries. Again, all these weird dashes don't always happen because there's so much randomness going on during a fight, and sometimes like Zed Shadow takes up a space and then they go into someplace weird. Sometimes they don't even jump at all because they have like a range unit right behind their main tank, and then you just like stay in the same place and just keep attacking. But again, there are going to be some games where you can punish the opponent and just get free round wins even if you have a much weaker board, just because they had a mental lapse in their positioning. Next, let's talk about focus fire. So we already did it a little bit here with the edgelords, but we could do a much simpler example. So a lot of people don't really know how to play in the early game because the early game is all about saving health. It's all about like making a lot of econ, but how exactly do you do that? So in the early game, you don't have too many units on the board. You might have something like a Corki, Cassante, Garen, like right at the start. And a lot of people just like do some random positioning like this, where they're just like all kind of spread out. Maybe it's like this. They're like, oh, they're not going to wrap on my Corki in a lot of cases, but they're not really paying that much attention to how they're positioning their team. So what a lot of high level players tend to do, they like to group all their units all on one side so that they focus one unit at a time. And that way, even if they have a really weak board in the early game during stage 2, they're still able to kill 1 or 2 units instead of taking full 4 unit losses or 5 unit losses, because that happens to a lot of people all the time. And if you kill 1 extra unit per fight during stage 2, each unit deals 2 player damage, so you end up saving 10 life. So some players may wonder, like, I watched this pro player play, did the same exact thing that I did. Why does he have like 70 life when I'm at 60? Well, this is one of those examples. The way they position is super important because if they're able to kill an extra unit because they focus fire, they're just going to have more life during the whole duration of the game. So what can we change about our game to kind of take advantage of that? Well, if you're super duper duper weak and you're just trying to lose streak but kill like 1 or 2 units, put all your units all the way on the edge. And that way, if they have someone like in the center, let's say that they have someone like Lilia there, and maybe they have like a cannon on the other side, your team will just walk towards the Lilia, attack her, hopefully kill her, and then maybe you lose the fight after that, but at least you killed 1 unit. This is especially true if you ever have good crowd control units. For example, Nami in the early game. Nami's really good at mana locking people, so a lot of times, like let's say you have a Cassante and he's at full mana, he's about to cast his ability, but then Nami stuns your Cassante doesn't cast his spell, and he's still taking damage, but he's not gaining any mana from that damage because he's already at full mana, and that's like a lot of wasted value on your Cassante or any tank unit. Doesn't have to be Cassante, this could happen to anyone. But pretty much if you group your team together so that they only focus 1 unit, there's generally going to be a lot more opportunities for those things to happen. A lot of times you watch the early game stage 2 fights and you're like, oh my god, this stupid bullcrap happened. And yeah, that happens every now and then no matter how you position. But if you position in certain ways, it definitely happens more often, and you'll end up cheesing a lot more fights throughout your whole like season in TFT. Obviously, there's a balance to this. As you get into the late game, let's say you have a real team out there, and here we have a standard AD flex board. Do we want to focus fire with our Caitlyn and Ezreal by putting them next to each other and also putting like Lucian there too? The answer would probably be no, because a lot of times the enemy can have AoE CCs such as Thresh. They just put Thresh right in front of our team like that, and sometimes they might hook Ezreal, Lucian, Caitlyn often in the corner wouldn't get hit, but you don't even want to risk some of your units getting hit like that. So there's always going to be a balance. Sometimes you want to group some of them together, maybe like this. Ezreal does jump around a bit, same with Lucian, so maybe having them next to Caitlyn in this specific instance isn't too horrible. But there's going to be a balance in the late game between grouping together and spreading out, and it's honestly going to have to depend on your matchups. You have to scout to check for CC units. Pretty much everything that we talked about in this entire video, you have to evaluate that, but for the opponents as well. So you have to be like, if they're going to do this, what do I have to do to kind of avoid that? Sometimes you do have to focus fire, put them together. This is especially important if you have like an even shroud, for example. Let's say you have even shroud on set. Obviously, you don't want your Ezreal over here attacking someone over there because the even shroud is not going to be applying there. That doesn't mean put Caitlyn and Ezreal next to each other all the time. Maybe you could have Ezreal over here. The even shroud hits an area like this. So Ezreal attacking this guy. So Ezreal attacking a unit over here. Still gonna have the even shroud applied to them. Caitlyn, everything she attacks, gonna have the even shroud applied to them as well. Again, there's always gonna be a weird balance. But that's kind of part of the art of TFT. You don't actually know what you're going to have to do every single time, and things are going to be different no matter what. Obviously, in this specific example, Lucian also reduces armor, except he reduces a flat amount instead of a percentage amount, such as even shroud. So maybe in this specific scenario, you might want your Lucian there next to your Caitlyn or over here. He does dash around, so his positioning doesn't matter as much as you think. Same with Ezreal, but you kind of want them all near your even shroud, and also kind of near the Lucian because he's going to be reducing a lot of armor for Ezreal and Caitlyn to hopefully blow up. Obviously, tons of pros and cons. If you're facing crowd divers, like obviously don't put your misfortune here. But if you're not facing crowd divers and there's no thresh on the enemy team, you could even do something like this, just like have everyone grouped up together, and it won't really matter because you don't get affected by any of those abilities that we talked about. In which case, focus firing in this scenario, going to be very well worth it because their units are just going to die a lot faster. This also brings us into our very last tip of the day, tip number 8, which is protecting your damage shred or any of your utility tank items. In TFT, there's a concept called like pure tanks and utility tanks. Utility tanks are things like people holding frontline items that aren't actually like that tanky. Like even shroud, let's read it. It's not that tanky. It gives 150 health, 20 magic resistance, and you gain 20 armor and magic resist for the first 10 seconds of combat. Like that's great, but that's nothing compared to like a Warmogs, a Stone Plate, a Steadfast Heart, things like that. But even shroud provides a ton of utility because it gives the Sunder effect, which reduces 30% of enemies' armor. Sunfire Cape, it gives 250 health, 20 armor, but it gives anti-heal to your team, which is a very, very useful thing. So those are called utility tank items. Other ones that are like that is going to be something like Ionic Spark. It's pretty much even shroud, but for magic damage. And then something like Redemption, which heals adjacent units and also reduces AoE damage against them. Let's contrast that to pure tank items such as like a Warmogs, maybe like a Dragon Claw, Bramble Vest, things like that. These are going to be what's called like pure tank items because they pretty much just give like a crap ton of tank traits. And these are going to be the two distinctions between your two sets of tank items. So you generally want all your pure tank items on one tank and all your utility tank items on a different tank. It's obviously not a set rule. You don't have to grief your game to do this perfectly. Oftentimes you don't even get 6 tank items, so you just put them all on one tank and combine them all. But if I had to choose in a perfect world, this is how I would set it up, but TFT, you have to often play in a suboptimal world. But let's get back to the point of this tip, and we need to protect our resistance shredding. So in order to do that, we don't want our utility tank to get targeted first. So we would never put Set over here, for example, because their damage dealers on the top right corner will just target Set first and he'll die and will be without armor shred for the rest of the round. So what we want to do instead is maybe put at least one tank there. Illaoi, maybe she's 1 star. She might die a little quickly, so maybe we might want to put Yorick there because he has all our main tank items. And then on the left-hand side, let's say their damage dealers are on the left. They have to go through 1 Tentacle, Thresh, and Illaoi before they get to Set. Contrast that with the positioning we had before, where on the right-hand side, they only really have to go through Illaoi and then reach our Set. And then the left-hand side is like kind of overprotected because we have a Tentacle, Thresh, and like our full main tank. So one thing you could do is put your main tank next to your utility tank and then put the rest of your filler tanks on the other side. So then it kind of equals out in terms of like tankiness on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Obviously, you could do this other thing called scouting. And if they have all their damage dealers on one side, just put your utility tank on the other side and then have everyone over here. For example, if they have everyone on the top right side because they are a country player, just have your utility tank over here, have them apply the debuff to everyone, and then you'll focus fire everyone. Your Yorick's going to be tanking for as long as he can against the Samira, and then your even shroud lives for as long as you can help it. So just to sum up the video, the main 8 things you need to take away from this is knowing how to position your frontline carries, how to position your crowd divers, what to do with Illaoi, how to manage your hard CC units, wrapping, edgelord positioning, focus firing, and protecting your utility tank items such as your resistance shredding. If you combine all of these, like, I guarantee your positioning will become better. It is a little tricky to do. You have to scout a lot, you have to practice a lot. And unfortunately, even if you know to do all these things, the only way to actually get better at it is by watching fights and positioning your team yourself, because it's all reacting on what the opponents are doing. Keep in mind, another thing is that in TFT, you have randomized matchups. So normally you face around 3 potential opponents per round. So you could set up your team to perfectly face 2 of your opponents, and then you just unluckily match up against a third person, which you're awfully positioned against. That could happen all the time. And even though you made the right play by positioning against 2 people, sometimes you get unlucky and face the one random person that counters you. There's always going to be trade-offs whenever you do anything in TFT, and it's just something that you have to keep in mind. But the best way to get better at this is to watch a lot of fights, see how units interact with each other, especially with like the edgelord jumping. Literally, you could just record your gameplay, rewatch the same fight over and over, and just watch each individual unit, see how they jump, see what they do, and then kind of use that information to put yourself in a better spot in the next round. But these are what I think are the most important positioning concepts that you need to be focusing on, and hopefully everyone learned something from this video. Let me know what your favorite tip was, and also if you do know a lot more, feel free to share some of your favorite tips in the comments below or in our Discord. The links will be in the description below for that. But that's going to be it from me today. If you want to learn more about the basics of TFT, feel free to check out my tier list every single Friday, either here on YouTube or on the website at bunnymuffins.lol. That's going to be it for me today. Hopefully I'll see you all next time.